What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys today. These are our top 5 least favorite picks in the draft. It is currently mid-June, and this list obviously is subject to change, and considering that these are our least favorite picks in the draft, these are players that we have mentioned in previous videos. It would be pretty weird if this were the first time we had brought up these players, considering we don't think that they're very strong draft picks where they're going in ADP. But if you guys don't agree, maybe you think these players are actually underrated, or if you think there are players that should be on this list that we may have not included, definitely let us know in the comment section down below. But before we do get into the video, just a quick shout out and reminder that if you do enjoy these videos, show your support by hitting that like button. We post videos 7 days a week, and to make sure you don't miss out on any of our uploads, follow along by subscribing to the channel. We're on the road to 100k subscribers. Our goal is to reach that by the start of the NFL season, and with your help, we definitely think we can make that a reality. Also, guys, our draft packages are available now at our website. You gain access to our tier-based rankings, risk ratings, individual video player breakdowns, lists of our sleepers, target, bust, players to target, players to avoid, and more. So if that interests you, once again, that's at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link, as always, in the description box below. With that being said, though, let's hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running back had the most receptions inside the 10-yard line last season. This was actually a 4-way player tie. The 4 running backs were Kyle Juszczyk, Austin Eckler, Chase Edmonds, and Kareem Hunt. So today we have a handful of winners. At the time of recording for YouTube, we have John Jacobs, Corey Williams, and Sawyer Hebbs. And as for Twitter, at ZHoganFootball, along with JC English 11. Congratulations to all of you. But as for today's stat of the day, in 2020, 3 wide receivers led the league in receptions of 40 yards or more. Those receivers were DeAndre Hopkins, DJ Moore, but which player was the third? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, without further ado, let's hop right into the video, and we're going to begin as usual with the player listed on the thumbnail, none other than Melvin Gordon of the Denver Broncos. Now currently, Melvin Gordon has an ADP of the running back 24, so if you draft him, he is going to be a player that you're going to rely on to have to start each and every week. Some people look at that draft price and they look at Melvin Gordon and what he was able to do last season, and they see a player that presents some draft day value. Gordon is of course coming off of his first season as a Denver Bronco, a pretty successful one for fantasy where he finished as the RB14 in both PPR and standard. That was on the back of 215 touches on the ground, just under 1,000 rushing yards, coming in with 986, 9 rushing touchdowns, and 44 targets, 32 receptions, another 158 receiving yards on the ground, even adding another touchdown through the air. All in all, pretty respectable numbers when you compile them all, nearly 1,150 total scrimmage yards, double-digit touchdowns, and considering the fact that this team should be much better offensively, adding another weapon to the quarterback room, Teddy Bridgewater possibly going to start. We saw exactly how fruitful he could be for receiving running backs. Mike Davis in a Teddy Bridgewater-led offense taking over for the injured Christian McCaffrey received 70 targets from the quarterback. So presumably if Teddy Bridgewater did get the nod and did get the start, that could be an overall boost for the running back in this offense. On top of that, the Denver Broncos have an extremely underrated wide receiving core that is going to bring back Courtland Sutton, who did tear his ACL early on in the 2020 season. The receiving core without Courtland Sutton is already underrated to begin with, led by Jerry Jeudy, but we cannot forget that the other receivers in this offense also stepped up when given the opportunity this past year. Receiver Tim Patrick was able to eclipse 100 receiving yards in 3 different games. He also had a multi-TD performance last season as well. And speaking of multi-TD performances, that was something also receiver KJ Hamler was able to put together. And when this team endured a ton of injuries to the receiver positions, KJ Hamler was a player who was receiving double-digit targets. So when looking at the wide receiving core in this offense behind Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton, they definitely have players that can step up in all aspects. Not to mention they have one of the most talented tight ends in the entire league, especially from a receiving standpoint, Noah Fant. So any way you look at it, the running back in this offense should have many more opportunities than they had in 2020. So for Melvin Gordon to be a player who put up pretty respectable numbers in his first year, I can see how a lot of people are interested in possibly taking him as the RB24, because if he was even able to put up the numbers he did last season, then in fact you would be getting a draft day discount. The main issue though with drafting Melvin Gordon this year is because we can't expect him to be the workhorse in this offense. This team not only drafted a running back in the second round, by running back standards that is extremely high draft capital invested to the position, but if that wasn't writing on the wall enough, the Denver Broncos moved up 5 draft spots in order to get him. They made a trade to go up 5 draft spots with the Atlanta Falcons Ravens. The Atlanta Falcons, we know, also heavily interested in getting a running back in the draft themselves. Clearly why the Denver Broncos felt the need to have to trade up in order to land him. As for Javonte Williams as a player, he's 5'10", 212 pounds, so definitely the prototypical size for a potential 3-down workhorse. As an athlete, many people will be quick to point out that he did run a slower than average 40-yard dash time, clocking in at 4.62, but don't let that be a reason that you're trying to avoid him. It isn't an end-all be-all stat. We know that 40-yard dash time is still faster than other successful running backs we've seen in the past few years, like James Robinson clocking in with a 4.64. Also Josh Jacobs, a running back who has had success on the ground since being drafted, and he was clocked in at a 4.69. Javonte Williams is still an exceptional athlete. He has an 89th percentile agility score, a 71st percentile burst score, two metrics that we see each season translate very well to the running back position. On top of that, in college, he was one of the most efficient running backs to ever do it, coming in with a 93rd percentile college efficiency rating. And considering that this team does need some help in the receiving game, Melvin Gordon, this was definitely an area where even though he was getting the opportunities, he really wasn't looking good in this area whatsoever. Like I had mentioned, 32 receptions in 2020, only accumulating 158 receiving yards, but looking at his catch rate, 72% is extremely low, and while some of that can be put on the back of the quarterback, there's still no excuse for any running back to post 3.59 yards per target. The Denver Broncos team has already came out and said how much they love Javonte Williams. He is the clear favorite to lead this backfield, yet he's being drafted behind Melvin Gordon and is likely going to play the 1A to the 1B in this offense. And if Melvin Gordon is playing second fiddle, then there's no way in heck he should ever be drafted as the running back 24. I strongly believe that by the time the fantasy drafts come around, Melvin Gordon will be drafted far behind where Javonte Williams is coming off the board, and at that point only, would we be discussing Melvin Gordon potentially being a pick we could consider. Alright guys, we're moving into the next player and jumping over to the wide receiver position, and the next player that's one of our least favorite draft picks is Jarvis Landry of the Cleveland Browns. The best way to identify players that are one of your least favorite draft picks definitely has to be when you're in mock drafts, or better yet, paid best ball drafts, and in those situations where your money is on the line, you're creating your roster, and when your turn is up, you're looking at your rankings and you see a player that you should be taking next based on your draft rankings. You look at the player, you look at your roster, and you just want no part of it. This is a situation we've been in numerous times with Jarvis Landry. Since Landry's been on the Cleveland Browns, his production has been all over the place. His first season as a Brown, he finished as the wide receiver 18 in PPR leagues, but that was on the back of 150 targets. Is 150 targets something that we can expect from Jarvis Landry? No way in heck. They have Odell Beckham. Say what you want about him, and of course we can't guarantee his health, but in a season where Odell Beckham was not healthy, aka last season, Jarvis Landry still appeared in 15 games, but put up his least productive fantasy season as a Brown. His targets and involvement in the offense have been decreasing with each season since joining the team. Like I'd mentioned, 149 targets in his first year. We saw a reduction in 2019 to 138 targets, reaching a pinnacle in the 2020 season, only receiving 101. The question we have to ask ourselves is this reduction in volume something that is going to continue to plague him for the 2021 season? And while I do think it's very likely he will receive over 100 targets, we cannot deny that this is still a team that has a run-first offensive approach. This team would like to rely on their defense to do most of the heavy lifting, allowing Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt to be the 1-2 punch, helping this team better control the clock, providing more positive game scripts for this team as a whole, taking the ball out of Baker Mayfield's hands, not forcing him to do too much, because that's when we've seen this team operate at its best. This is now a team that has serious playoff aspirations, putting themselves in a position where in the third and fourth quarter they're having to put up a ton of pass attempts is just not what they're trying to do. And Jarvis Landry, unfortunately, being a player that does require volume in order to put up fantasy points, this is going to be a huge detriment into his season-long fantasy value as well as his week-to-week consistency. We've seen seasons from him where he's received 140, 150, 160 targets, where he still has been unable to eclipse 1,000 receiving yards. And when slotting him out for what we can expect from him for the 2021 season, the expected target totals for Landry are nowhere near those previous numbers he's seen. With that being said though, let's hop over to our next player. We're bouncing back to the running back position, and the next player we have that's one of our least favorite draft picks definitely has to be Damien Harris of the New England Patriots. Now, when it comes to Damien Harris, this is a player in drafts that is probably going higher than you would expect. Depending on platform and scoring settings, you can see him drafted as high as the RB26 or as low as the RB34. Either way you look at it, he is by far the earliest drafted New England Patriots running back. So many people, when looking to fill up their running back position, trying to identify players drafted in the middle to later rounds that could potentially be a workhorse for any offense, seeing Damien Harris's name still on the board, noticing that no New England running back has been drafted yet, a lot of people could see Damien Harris and look to him as a potential running back with guaranteed volume to potentially compete for your flex or RB2 spot. Due to how thin the running back position is as a whole, I can't fault anybody for feeling that way about Damien Harris. I'm not going to sit here and deny that he has a clear pathway to touches in this offense early and often. I wouldn't be surprised to see him as early as week 1, getting 10 to possibly 15 touches on the ground, even possibly seeing a snap share in this offense of 50 plus or 60 plus % right out of the gate. My main concern with Damien Harris was never going to be his role in this offense. My concerns with Damien Harris always came down to him being an extremely one-dimensional running back. In his 12 games as a pro, this is a player who's only received 7 targets. They still, of course, have James White on the roster, one of the premier receiving running backs in the league. So we should have no reasonable expectation of Damien Harris to see an uptick in production in the receiving game. And when it comes to running backs who are more one-dimensional and only get their production through rush attempts on the ground, those players have extreme volatility week over week. They're also heavily reliant on game script. In order for them to have a good game, a lot of things have to go in their favor. They have an extremely low floor because if you think about it, with most leagues being some form of PPR or half PPR, any running back that's going to get 4 or 5 receptions a week is going to have a receiving floor of around 4 to 5 points, and that's before any receiving yardage is added to the table. Most running backs are easily able to average 5, 6, 7 yards per reception, so a running back who's able to put up 4 receptions for 28 receiving yards, that's already 6.8 fantasy points in a PPR league, 4.8 in a half PPR league, and for runners who only get their production on the ground like Damien Harris, in order to even match that production, he would need to rush for 48 to 68 rushing yards. For reference, 68 rushing yards would take 17 rush attempts for a running back who is averaging 4 yards per carry. A stat line for Damien Harris at the end of the day being 17 for 68, that would in no way be a surprising stat line for a player like Damien Harris to finish in any given week. And while ultimately to attain that stat line, he was running efficiently on top of receiving a hefty amount of touches, 17 for 68 simply put isn't going to cut it. That's 6.8 fantasy points. That isn't even flex level production, meaning in order for Damien Harris and players like him to put up starter production to be trusted in our flex or possibly RB2 slot, he's going to have to score touchdowns. That's exactly where the week-to-week volatility comes in. In those weeks where he scores, you're likely going to be happy with starting him. In the weeks he doesn't, you're likely going to be disappointed. As we know, Cam Newton, he is a vulture at that area of the field. Last season as the Patriots starter, Cam Newton put up a whopping 12 rushing touchdowns. How many of those do you think could have possibly gone to Damien Harris if Cam Newton wasn't there vulturing those touchdowns? That being said, Damien Harris could potentially have a bit more upside if Mac Jones is going to be listed as the starter to start the season, but that isn't going to take away the fact that he is still one-dimensional. It will just give him a bit more possible upside in the touchdown department. If that wasn't enough, we also have to factor in that Damien Harris is an extreme risk to miss time due to injury. Sports Injury Predictor gives him a 70% chance of injury in the 2021 season, which lines up very well with our risk model, which pegs him as the 76th safest running back. Alright guys, we're moving into the 4th player on this list of our least favorite picks in the draft, and this player is wide receiver Kenny Golladay of the New York Giants. When it comes to Kenny Golladay and the reason he is one of our least favorite draft picks, the assessment for him, it's pretty simple. Kenny Golladay being the premier free agent wide receiver, it's not all that surprising that the New York Giants went out of their way to land Kenny Golladay in free agency. The New York Giants have been doing whatever they could to add as many weapons in the receiving game to try to alleviate some of the pressure from Daniel Jones to give a fair assessment on whether he is the quarterback of the future, whether they can go on a possible run in a division that's definitely winnable. By signing Kenny Golladay, giving this team the top option in free agency at wide receiver, this should give us a good idea on whether Daniel Jones is going to be the solution for this team for the future, or if maybe the receiving core wasn't what was holding this team back, potentially putting some of the blame on the lack of consistency and play at the quarterback position. Regardless, Kenny Golladay was brought in to fill a specific role for this passing offense, as opposed to him being brought onto a team that just has no wide receivers, no receiving tight ends whatsoever, potentially putting him in a position where he has to be a complete target hog. We've seen top free agent wide receivers transition to teams where they're completely decimated at the receiver positions, where any chains being moved between the 20s through the air always went through these new receivers. Well, when it comes to Kenny Golladay, that is completely not the case. The New York Giants have one of the deepest wide receiving cores, tight end groups from a receiving standpoint, as well as having one of the league's best receiving running backs on the roster. So Kenny Golladay isn't joining a situation where he's going to have to need to compete with his career highs when it comes to targets. He's more so going to have to be relied upon to perform very well in the area where they need him, which is definitely the area of the red zone. This team has been severely lacking a big-bodied possession receiver, a role that they attempted to fill with the smaller Darius Slayton that had been previously filled by Evan Engram over the past few seasons. Evan Engram, as we know, has been one of the more disappointing players receiving a high volume share in this offense. Expect a lot of the same looks that they were previously giving over to Evan Engram to make their way over to Kenny Golladay, and while ultimately that will mean he's going to have a more featured presence in the red zone, that doesn't necessarily mean he's the type of player we can expect to have 8+ targets per game. Golladay himself has never been a high volume receiver. His two highest targeted seasons as a pro, he received 116 targets and 119 targets alike. Those target totals are well within the range of what we can expect for the 2021 season, although we cannot guarantee exactly how efficient Daniel Jones will be while targeting him. We have to assume there will be a drop-off when it comes to efficiency, downgrading from Matthew Stafford to Daniel Jones. Historically, free agent wide receivers in their first year on a new offense typically struggle when building the connection with the new quarterback, so expect Daniel Jones and Kenny Golladay not to be the exception to this rule. On top of that, the New York Giants have no incentive in force-feeding targets to Kenny Golladay. They have one of the deepest receiving cores in the entire league, with a wide receiver group with the likes of John Ross, Darius Slayton, Sterling Shepard, on top of first-round rookie 20th overall selection Kadarius Toney. If that doesn't scream deep, then also factor in that on top of those receivers, they also still have Evan Engram, and although Kyle Rudolph, the tight end that the New York Giants signed this offseason, is well past his prime, if need be, Kyle Rudolph is no slouch in the receiving game himself. Then when we factor in that this team also has Saquon Barkley returning from injury this season, a healthy Saquon Barkley is going to garner his own massive target market share. So when it comes to Kenny Golladay, although he is going to be a great addition for this team to use him in the areas where they're lacking, if you're somebody out there who's trying to target Kenny Golladay and get him on your fantasy team because you see him as potentially a player who can compete for his career high in targets, well, sadly, I think you're mistaken. The signing of Kenny Golladay is a really good football move for Daniel Jones as well as this offense as a whole, but as an individual contributor, I find it really difficult to imagine Kenny Golladay sees career highs in any major category, and with the sheer amount of options that this team does have in the passing game, coupled with the early season struggles we typically see from free agent wide receivers transitioning teams, it's no surprise why Kenny Golladay makes our list of least favorite draft picks for 2021. Alright guys, we're moving into the final player on today's list. It is none other than wide receiver from the Pittsburgh Steelers, Juju Smith-Schuster. When it comes to Juju Smith-Schuster, the formula for him is quite simple. Juju Smith-Schuster has been a player that's been regressing in major categories ever since his initial breakout in his rookie and sophomore seasons, and although he did re-sign with the Pittsburgh Steelers on a one-year deal, we do know that this Pittsburgh Steelers team, as well as Juju Smith-Schuster, both have one foot out the door. Had this been a different free agent market, had we seen the cap limit increase as opposed to decrease, had more teams had more money to spend in free agency, then Juju Smith-Schuster I could definitely see as a player who would have heavily hit the open market, but instead he did opt to re-sign with the team on a lesser contract with the goal of hitting the free agent market next offseason, where presumably more teams should have more money to spend at the wide receiver position. As it stands for the Pittsburgh Steelers, the re-signing of Juju Smith-Schuster, while it will help this team overall from an offensive standpoint, he wasn't re-signed to be one of the team's leading receivers. At this point, he is likely at best going to be third in the pecking order when it comes to target market share at the wide receiver position. Deontay Johnson, the heavy favorite to lead this team from a target standpoint, possibly even lead the entire NFL from a target standpoint, and behind him we have Chase Claypool, the rookie last season who was an absolute stud. We saw this is the type of player, if you get the ball in his hands, he can do miraculous things with it. He scored 4 touchdowns in one game, proving yet again how the Pittsburgh Steelers are one of the best teams in NFL history at drafting wide receivers. This team was more than happy moving into the 2021 season with the likes of Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, and James Washington with a mix of other wide receivers to shore up that position. So Juju Smith-Schuster opting to take a lesser contract in order to stay on the team. While yes, it is going to benefit this team offensively, we already know that this team was fully committed to moving forward without him, which shouldn't come as too much of a surprise because when looking at Juju Smith-Schuster and what he was able to do on the field, he really hasn't looked like the same type of player we saw in years past. What we saw from 2020 Juju was a player that really struggled to get open. We already know earlier on in his career when Antonio Brown left the Pittsburgh Steelers offense, Juju Smith-Schuster in turn was forced to face more difficult coverage, and this is when we started to see the kinks in the armor of Juju Smith-Schuster. Juju Smith-Schuster should no longer be looked at a player who can beat some of the league's top defenses, and while in previous seasons he was able to make up for that in the area of volume, but now that not even volume is guaranteed to Juju Smith-Schuster, we're going to have many weeks for this upcoming season where Juju is going to be posting duds. Not only does this team have more of an incentive to target receivers like Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool ahead of Juju Smith-Schuster due to the fact that they have a long-term commitment in developing those receivers. Juju Smith-Schuster, a player that they already know has one foot out the door, awaiting to be signed by a team to offer him a juicy contract in a higher market area. Meanwhile, this team has a vested interest in the long-term development of a player Chase Claypool, who we already got a glimpse of excellence when given an opportunity in a small sample last season. Why would the team opt to increase opportunities for a player with one foot out the door who's already been regressing in major categories over the past few seasons? Meanwhile, you haven't began to unlock the potential upside for a receiver coming into his second year of a 4-year rookie contract. For that reason, it's easy to see why the team has already been noted to make a move of Juju Smith-Schuster to play more of an outside role, a role that you know already that he doesn't play his best in. We've known in years past when given the opportunity to compete with outside wide receivers, Juju Smith-Schuster struggled, but in order to make way for new receivers like Chase Claypool to see an increase in his target market share, these are just the moves that have to happen. So Juju Smith-Schuster is slated to be third in the pecking order for targets, playing a position that we know he's not optimal in. And when looking at the Pittsburgh Steelers team as a whole for the 2021 season, this is a team that we're expecting to see a reduction in passing volume. The Pittsburgh Steelers have one of the best defenses in the entire league. There's no need for Ben Roethlisberger, an aging Ben Roethlisberger, to finish the season 4th in pass attempts, which is exactly what he did last year. And if this team has any hopes in potentially making a playoff run or beyond, slowing the game down, relying on their defense, a clear sign as to why the team opted to draft Najee Harris in the first round, doubling down on the team's increased focus on slowing down the game. Because of that, the passing volume as a whole is likely to reduce, and for a player like Juju Smith-Schuster, who has typically relied on heavier volume in order to produce for fantasy, on top of him being moved to a less than ideal position for him where he doesn't play his best, coupled with the fact that this team has no long-term incentive in heavily targeting or relying on Juju Smith-Schuster, and altogether, you have a strong case for why Juju Smith-Schuster is one of our least favorite draft picks. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.